for joining our third installment of Geothink&Learn on governing AI. A special thank you to those of you sharing your lunch hour with us. We welcome and appreciate you joining us on your work breaks. So my name is Sonia. I am the project manager here at Geothink, and I will be moderating today's panel. So I'll begin by welcoming our group of panelists who will each present their expertise on the various implications of artificial intelligence today for cities, citizens, and policy. So starting with Renee Sieber, our panel chair and principal investigator here at Geothink. Hi, Renee.
Hi.
She is the Associate Professor of Geography and Environment here at McGill, followed by Elizabeth Judge, Professor of Law at the Faculty of Law, University of Ottawa. And then we have Fenwick McKelvey, Assistant Professor of Information and Communication Technology Policy at Concordia's Department of Communication Studies. And finally, last but certainly not least, we have Pamela Robinson, Associate Professor and Dean at Ryerson School of Urban and Regional Planning, and who is becoming a bit of a fixture, a regular fixture at our Geothink&Learns. So the panel will be followed by an open Q&A session to all participants. So before I pass it over to Professor Sieber, I'm just going to remind our viewers of the three principal ways that they can participate in today's event. So first, by clicking the raise your hand feature. So you can find this on the top right of your screen. What this does is it notifies the panel that you'd like to ask a video question, which means that you will be recorded while asking your question. And in order to do so, you'll have to accept a pop-up from the system to share your microphone settings. The second way is to ask a written question through the Q&A feature, which is the Q&A button also found on the top left of your screen. So this will not record you on the video, and what it does, it sends a written question to our panel, which we will answer either verbally or written through the chat box. So finally, there's a Q&A chat function at the bottom of your screen. So you're welcome to post questions through the chat feature or to chat with our panelists throughout the webinar. If you'd like to pose an anonymous question, you can do so through the Q&A by clicking anonymous, and this will not identify your name to our panel. So unfortunately, these options are not available to those of you who are phoning in, but feel free to email us questions at any time or to tweet questions at GeothinkCA. We will also be doing a live tweet of questions from today's panel, so feel free to tweet us your questions at any point. So lastly, just a final reminder that this panel will be recorded and posted on geothink.ca and disseminated elsewhere. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Professor Sieber.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on AI. Hopefully, we'll enlighten you a little bit and demystify AI and algorithms, and also give you some insight into the implications of AI and algorithms for governments and in governance. So, whoops. Sorry about that. Does everyone see my slides? Okay, excellent. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to take you through how do we hold AI accountable, especially when we don't know how AI works. And so there's a lot of hyperbole around AI, and this is just one of many examples. Here's the CEO of Tesla saying that AI is an existential threat to the world and a bigger threat than North Korea. And this is in a talk he had to the US Governors Conference. And if that doesn't get you worried, then I don't know what will. But I mean, what are we worried about? The way that AI is posed, it's almost like the world will end if we have one of these super Skynet kind of machines. but I'll try to sort of break it down just a tiny bit for you. So what is an AI? Very simply, it is an intelligent machine. It's a machine that either acts like a human, so it's making decisions, it's interacting with you like a human, or it's performing better than a human. It's calculating faster, and in governance and governments, it's supposed to be more neutral and more objective, and I'm sure I won't be the only one today who's going to question that objectivity. AIs are usually conflated with algorithms. Now, algorithms often play a role in AI, but they're not the same. An algorithm is only a set of rules, which these days are set in code. So usually the two of these are conflated. But here I'm going to try and tell you why AIs and algorithms are not as complicated as you might think they are, because AIs are very much like my love of nachos. So I've been making nachos for a very long time. I absolutely adore nachos. So let's say I have an algorithm, and that's a recipe, and that recipe tells me how I should be making these nachos, and the rules and algorithms are unambiguous. In other words, beans are not guacamole. So if I carry this analogy, and we'll see how far I can stretch this analogy for AI, not only are algorithms, particularly machine learning algorithms, like my preparing one single batch of nachos, they could possibly determine what I could cook on the basis of what I have in my fridge. And over time, what I tend to stock in my fridge. And many algorithms are trained with data, the contents of my fridge. They learn over time, my God, she loves nachos excessively, and then predict when and what I want to eat. 2 weeks have gone by and she hasn't had nachos. So therefore, I'm going to see if she has enough ingredients to make nachos. So, of course, it's just me and my love of nachos, but it could be what hundreds of thousands of people have in their fridges with thousands of ingredients and millions of possible combinations to predict what can you make out of the contents of your fridge and off of your shelves. The thing is about AIs in particular is that the way the AIs test out the combinations are not the way human beings may test them out. They're not known to you. So for example, you could have tests that are completely antithetical to the way humans may think about combining contents in the fridge. Baking soda and fermented bean paste. So humans would necessarily do that, but an AI might. So this is Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert's Perceptron. This is an element of an AI, a single neuron in the brain, a single perceptron in AI. So you've got inputs, you weight them differentially. I don't like guacamole a lot, so I'll give that a lower weight. You sum the weights and you see whether the threshold is met, whether I'm going to eat it or not. In other words, and I should mention that one of these inputs could be the result of an algorithm, right? So here we go in my nacho example for AI. Each one of these inputs have different weights. There's the weighted sum with a plate of nachos. My step function is, do I want to eat it or not? Output. So that's a single perceptron. Unfortunately, or fortunately, there are thousands and thousands of these perceptrons interacting, and you'll notice that now they're arranged what's called the input layer, the hidden layer, and the output layer. And believe it or not even AI researchers or specialists know what's inside the hidden layer. So that should give us some pause. So how might we hold them accountable? And I'm just have 3 ways in which we might hold them accountable, given that there is so much hidden about how they function. that same Elon Musk, CEO of Tesla, started an institute called OpenAI. And what he's proposing is to hire a lot of AI specialists and build AIs that are, thanks Sonia, to create a DIY toolkit for AIs. So that's one possibility of making them more transparent. The question, of course, is how many people are going to understand what's going on except for the AI specialists. Another possible way to handle AI is what's called a right to explanation, and that's usually codified in law, and that suggests that you have the right to know what the outcome of a decision was and what went into making that decision. So that existed before AI. So if you think about credit card companies or maybe a mortgage company and they denied you a loan, this is the same thing that's being proposed for algorithms in AI. The third and the last thing is about auditing. And this is a recent law that's been proposed in New York City to force AI and algorithm companies that supply these things to the city to force the companies to accept training data from users. So look, I'm a nonprofit environmental group. I want to see how your AI works or what output it produces. So I'm going to give you some data, and then you also have to show me what the output is. These aren't without their challenges. So I'm going to conclude by saying that that even as we try to hold AIs accountable, AIs are getting increasingly more complicated, and the goal of many companies is to make sure they can't be reverse engineered. They may not be the rights that you want. In other words, you know, just because they give you some information about an AI doesn't mean you understand it. In fact, Google argued that there's such a little thing, you know, AIs will have such a minimal impact on decisions that we shouldn't be worrying about them. We have to worry about the whole notion of making something transparent, because just because you make something transparent doesn't mean that you have a legal recourse or any kind of recourse if you're denied a mortgage, if you're redlined and you're not allowed to get insurance. These companies will argue that if you try to do any kind of accountability, this could stifle innovation because they have to have these, proprietary algorithms in which to innovate. They'll also argue that they pose security risks. Oh my God, if we make this, expose this stuff, then there will be all these hackers coming in and hacking the AI. There's an argument that they risk re-identification because personal information might be used as inputs and this could be revealed. And I'll conclude with they don't think like us. And here is my concluding examples on how they don't think like us. This is a cat, and the AI thinks it's a cat, and you can see in the bar chart, with just slight changes in pixels, all of a sudden it thinks it's guacamole. And with that, I will hand it over to our next presenter. Thank you. Are you ready, Sonia?
Yep, so we'll hear from Elizabeth Judge next.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I'll be speaking about algorithmic governance, which is the intersection of things like big data, these more sophisticated algorithms, and law. So this has been a constant push and pull about decision-making in law, which really goes back centuries. And I put on this table sort of pros and cons on each side. So on the one side, you have things like justice and laws. On the other side, a more sort of equity and morals type of approach. The good thing about laws and justice is you have predictability. The good thing about equity is that you have fairness. So this has been integrated in a number of ways in law. Rules on the one side, more flexible standards on the other, deciding before, setting up the rule system and the framework before, and then other ones on deciding after. One can say that one side is more objective and the other side is more subjective. One side maybe is more equal and the other side is more discriminatory. So theoretically, algorithmic governance holds out maybe the best of all worlds. So on the one side, one could say it provides the promise of both rules and individualization, that it allows us to mitigate the so-called risk of human decisions and not be so arbitrary or subjective. The optimistic scenario here is that it's akin to personalized medicine. The downside is, on a peril side, that we have rules, albeit increasingly finer ones, but we're still lacking the ethics and the morals side, so that we're removing the best of human decision-making. We've got, we don't have mercy, flexibility, and discretion as we start putting in more sophisticated algorithms and reliance on big data. So the pessimistic scenario here is this Kafkaesque one. So for those of you who know the trial, there's a parable inside of that where this man from the country is seeking the law. It's called Before the Law parable. And he goes and he finds this very imposing door and a doorkeeper. And he tries to get in. The doorkeeper says, sometime, but not now. And so over the course of his life, he basically sits there, he provides bribery and does a number of other things. And at the end of his life, when he's dying, the doorkeeper starts to shut the door. And the man says, well, why is it that no one else has sought the law? How come I'm the only one that's ever been here? And the doorkeeper says, because the door was just for you. And so it raises this idea of having increasingly fine rules, and yet it can be very individualized and still be arbitrary and pessimistic. It can still be an unfair system because people may not know the rules and may not know the algorithms. As we think of algorithms, we do often think of them as purely or mostly automated. There's automated data collection, there's algorithms for data inferences, which may or not be good predictors, there's automated decisions, and it sets up this system as if we have code versus humans, a chasm between that, where we have an information asymmetry between regulators and technology. We have the so-called black box problem, where the algorithms know more about us than we know about the algorithms. But of course, it's also important to keep in mind that there is a large human component to all of this. Humans are setting the objective, the categories, the coding, the inferences, and refining the rules. So if you think, for example, of a candidate who wants to have more voters for them, the candidate sets the objectives to find the pockets of persuadable voters. The data company, the data analytic company, like a Cambridge Analytica, might come in and set categories based on those profiles. A human then codes the algorithm. You get those results, and then a human will go back and continually sort of manipulate what the algorithm is in order to make it better at persuading the people and finding them for the vote. So if you think of algorithms and elections, and we could think of this in a municipal context, and drawing on Rumsfeld's famous saying, we've got known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. So we know that big data is being collected about voters. We know the parties have databases. We know that there are data intermediaries and micro-targeting. We don't know exactly what type of inferences are being made or how nuanced they are. We don't know how much data is being used or even how good the inferences are. We don't know what type of messaging the micro-targeting is delivering, and we don't know what we don't know, of course. And so this is a picture from the conservative SIMS database, but it's, you know, broadly similar to what you might see in other party databases. And they're putting people supposedly in spectrums, where we've got non-supporters and supporters, somewhat persuadable, somewhat not, and undecided. And this is a really big decision for parties, because there's also research showing that if you target people who are not persuadable, that they might not have voted for your opponent, but if you start to target them, they can be swayed to be mobilized against you. So it's a real difficult process of calibrating. And so, of course, candidates are increasingly looking for more and more data in order to be able to do that. But over time, as the micro-targeting becomes more detailed, and as candidates increasingly seek sort of the perfect voter of who's persuadable but isn't yet deciding to vote, you get a scenario where some people may not hear the party's message at all. As messaging becomes more and more micro-targeted and more precise, they may hear only a partial message, or they may not hear the message at all. And this is somewhat contradictory then to how we think of elections, where a candidate goes door to door, where they are having a give and take with the person is reading the candidate's reading the person, they're deciding what to share and what more to know. We're moving toward a system where the candidates know information that the voter doesn't know that they know, and doesn't know what's being shared with them. And this is working against a system too, where the candidate is able to interact with voters more, to understand where the consensus areas are that they can emphasize. So this is really sort of a redo of the black box problem. We've got, on the one hand, secret voting, on the other hand, this public system of elections and campaigning and canvassing, but more and more that public system is moving to a private system of micro-targeting. So with respect to the law, algorithms raise all sorts of questions. Who decides the rules? What does transparency entail? Who's accountable? Are more individualized categories sometimes less ethical? So if you've got a city council meeting and they put people in boxes and then say to you, oh, we don't need your participation because we've already got your box of whatever that profile is covered, that seems to look unfair, but maybe it's more representative. How would you appeal that decision? What does a judge do when there's a case involving an algorithm? So to give a range of examples where this comes up, we've got credit scores, adoption, employment, price discrimination, insurance, sentencing and parole, jury pools. All of these are areas where the law is based on having specific inferences about people, but as we rely more on algorithms, we take away people's decision-making from that. And so to conclude, when we think about algorithmic governance, we really need to think about how to install fairness at the design stage, what disclosure and transparency might cover, to encourage public conversations about whether newer technology is necessarily better, and we can talk about that in the question session, and to encourage a public conversation about what information people want known and considered and shared and analyzed. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Elizabeth. So we'll take it over to Professor Fenwick McKelvey. It's always wonderful to discuss ethics of algorithms from a law professor with an English literature background. So thank you for that Kafka allegory. And so Fenwick, whenever you're ready, we'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, I'm there. I'm just, it just didn't let me share the screen here.
No problem.
It was just working.
And in line with our panel, machines don't always comply with our intents.
Okay, so you can see my screen here. And this is just what I want to, there's the AI, you can see the AI policy?
Yes.
Beauty. Okay, so just let me actually show it full screen. Okay, so thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I'm really kind of excited for this conversation, and I just want to thank my last two panelists, because I think they set up a lot of the questions at work in some of these governance questions about AI and algorithms. And I think to me, and a lot of my work is trying to think about AI, algorithms, and big data on a spectrum, and part and parcel of a kind of a long-standing conversation, or lack of a conversation in Canada, about what are the implications of some of these technologies. And to me, I've been trying to think about, well, what's going on and what are the areas that this conversation is taking place in Canada. So I wanted today, I think, to share the best of, to best of my knowledge, what is the state of AI policy in Canada. And so this is putting together just some of the trends that are taking place in AI in Canada. So just to say that, first off, there's a significant amount of investment being done in artificial intelligence in Canada right now. I think it's important to recognize that Edmonton, Montreal, and Toronto have all been hubs of investment, particularly in the part of Google, Facebook, to various degrees, trying to stimulate and capitalize on Canada's good track record of being a leader in AI research, and particularly in being in Montreal. This is kind of one of the hotbeds of this work. Now, the concern being is that as much as there is attention to AI research development, Canada doesn't have as much investment, or it's not so much as a policy hub. There really isn't the same amount of investment we're seeing in AI development as there is about AI policy. So from my scan of these hubs, it's very unclear where they actually have teams of researchers actually dedicated to talking about the economic, cultural, social, political consequences of these technologies. There is, secondly, kind of a lack of coordination. There's no dedicated nonprofit that is working or being a leader in kind of AI issues in Canada. And so there's a lot of uncoordination between the different sectors in Canada around AI. And then third, the investment, the government's investment, the federal government's investment in algorithmic AI and algorithms hasn't necessarily been matched by any changing funding structure or to the funding structure or any other actually developments of these institutions. And so I'm just referencing a nice piece from Globe and Mail from Mike and Taylor Roll, and they're basically saying, you know, echoing these concerns about the funding for AI. Now, there are projects being done that is actively kind of scoping out what are the implications for artificial intelligence in Canadian policy. And one of the leads is taking place at the Treasury Board of Canada, which is presently drafting policy on responsible AI. And so this has been a white paper that's been shared online, and very interesting because it's the first time that a government institution has been using Google Docs as a consultation mechanism. And there's certainly some questions about how this process is taking place, but I really welcome the transparency. And they're talking through how they will think about AI, what are some of the risks and responsibility, and really been doing a lot of listening. And that document is going to be taken back to the federal government. And for those who don't know, the Treasury Board really sets policy for the rest of the departments. And so the recommendations of the responsible AI document will then be setting kind of government-wide policy about AI could be used. And the report talks about the ideas of using chatbots, and it's certainly trying to think through what are the ways, to Elizabeth's point, you might be able to automate certain decision makings and figuring out, trying to negotiate that relationship between where humans are working and ways you might mitigate some of that human labor to increase government efficiency. There has been some limited studies on the part of kind of the nonprofit or the research sector. So the Brookfield Institute has been looking at automation in Canada and some of the potential risks or threats to automation. And the report, which I linked to here, basically is talking about what governments are possibly, what are the kind of concerns about automation. I think that this is an interesting thread because automation is often associated with potential risks or pitfalls of AI and artificial intelligence. And that's certainly something that spec work needs to be done. And so the Brookfield Institute is able to starting to map out these things. And I'll get to some people are asking questions and I'll write them. I can't talk and answer questions at the same time. So first time, I'm a terrible multitasker. It's also interesting that Canada does now increasingly host a number of conferences that are trying to gather together and trying to emphasize these ethical considerations. So we had the Fairness and Accountability and Transparency in Machine Learning Conference. It was held in Halifax. We also had a forum on socially responsible development of AI in Montreal, and we also have another one, Intelligence Artificielle on Mission Sociale, coming up in January here. So we are seeing that conferences are becoming key parts for stakeholders to start discussing these questions of artificial intelligence. And finally, I'll put a plug in tonight. If anybody's at Concordia University, we're hosting an AI ethics meetup group, which is one of the ways that local community groups are talking about AI ethics. And that's working towards a Montreal, a declaration of responsible development of AI in Montreal. Just for the latter parts, to me, I think that there's a broad set of concerns we might have in terms of developing AI. I think to me, often when we talk about ethical AI or AI policy frameworks, often we use ethics in the narrow sense about individual ethics. And really, to me, it's about thinking systematically about who has power, who's developing AI, and trying to address the broader social consequences of AI and not the kind of limited concerns about bias as a kind of statistical concern. I think the second part is trying to disentangle AI in general from its specific applications. And so, when we're talking about the government's use of AI, there's a difference between using AI as a chatbot and using AI to make decisions in the judicial context. And so I think what the next steps for AI policy is going to be is moving from these kind of moving from this kind of broad concern that Renee talked about at the start towards these more specific questions. Finally, the last 2 points is the talking about theories of complexity. I think to me, AI isn't one thing, and it doesn't exist in a vacuum. And so it's trying to actually understand how threat agents, like people trying to game cats, cat recognizing algorithms, or in the case of network neutrality, trying to game the systems are going to be put in place and deployed. And I think to me, that's a really kind of legal and theoretical question. How do we understand the complexity of AI as part of these wider, what I would call assemblages or ecologies? And the final point, just in terms of key questions, is to identify what are some national, how can national AI policy establish international best practices? So I think Canada, I always want to champion this, Canada could be a real world leader if we actually invest in proper AI policy. In terms of emerging policy areas, I think the ones that I just really want to highlight is that we have a discussion right now at the CRTC about discoverability and the changing nature of broadcasting. And I think there's an intersection between artificial intelligence and algorithms and cultural policy. This is also, I just want to say, the network neutrality, which is going on in the States. It's an issue here in Canada, has been for a long time. And network neutrality to me is an AI question. And I'm also doing some work on political bots and micro-targeting in the lead up to the 2019 federal election. And so we have to start thinking of the ways that micro-targeting and forms of automated agents that we call bots might be increasingly deployed in the political context, as Elizabeth mentioned. And I think these are all, I think, important emerging issue areas that I'd love to talk about in the discussion period, and something that I'll be working on in the future. And so thank you very much. And just as a plug, some of my, for those interested in AI, this is a diagram that I commissioned for Oliver Selfridge's Pandemonium. This is his decision-making demons, and inspiration for me in my book, Internet Demons, which will be coming out from the University of Minnesota Press in 2018. And I can talk about that more in questions too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fenwick. So we'll take it over to Professor Pamela Robinson.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for the chance to talk to you on your lunch hour today. I'm going to take what Fenwick talked about and scale down from the federal down to the local. I'm the resident urban planner on the Geothink research team, and for the last 8 years, I've been studying in particular how weird and wonderful and new technology finds its way into city halls to ask the question, what does this tech mean for real people where they live and for local government staff in cities across Canada? And so I'm really interested in when this technology finds its way into the formal and ordinary and kind of mundane work of City Hall. It's easy to see the potential in the broader civil society or the challenges, but I'm interested in what happens when it finds its home in the institutional governance and decision-making processes inside our communities. One of the things you'll see in a couple of minutes is that my principal preoccupation in this landscape of research and practice is that I'm really interested in the public good. What's the impact of this technology on people where they live, and on municipal civil servants where they do their work, and on municipal politicians in terms of how they take decisions. So I'm much more interested in the democratic outcomes than I am in the economic ones. So what I'm going to argue today in my little 7 minutes that I've got left is that one of the interesting things about artificial intelligence technology that makes it differ from, say, things like GeoWeb tools where we have online maps or open data, or other technology, is that there's a material or a practical piece to it that makes it different in terms of the way in which we're going to embrace it or reject it or mediate it. And what I'm going to talk about today is that if we start to think about scaling down the use of artificial intelligence in cities in an urban context, it presents this interesting sandbox for research and study. Because in fact, when we scale down AI to the city scale or to the community scale or the household scale, it creates this intimacy that people can start to understand. It's one thing to talk about AI, I think, in the global financial system. It's a very different thing to talk about artificial intelligence, for example, in the form of automated and self-driving cars in people's neighborhoods. And so what I want to talk about is the tangibility of AI in urban settings, and to start to think about how that placing AI in urban settings helps us start to build a better framework for governance and for understanding human-technology interactions. I'm not sure how many of you have read the book Weapons of Math Destruction by Cathy O'Neill, but she identifies 3 characteristics of what she calls dangerous algorithms. And the 3 characteristics are scale, secrecy, and destructiveness. And these are really important considerations, I think, when we start talking about issues around algorithmic governance, because in part, they're the kinds of things that we can use to seed public consultations and political decision-making processes around the impacts of artificial intelligence and broader algorithmic governance issues. So if we start with the assumption that if we're going to use this technology in our cities, we need informed citizen consent, then we need to build a governance framework around that. And that assumption around informed citizen consent is one that's probably debatable, but I think in terms of the ethics of public good, it's really important that people understand the technology that's being applied to them. And I'm working on an article right now for Spacing Magazine, which I write for, which will be published next week around some practical examples. But what I want to focus on here is how do we set a table for meaningful discussions about artificial intelligence and its impacts on people? And how do we build on O'Neill's recommendations when we think about the scale of the impact, the extent of which the decisions are being made, and what's the math that's being used, and how is that math or the algorithm being framed and used, and whether or not it's secret or public, and what's the potential for harm or destructiveness. So these 3 things, scale, secrecy, and destructiveness, are a good starting point. And as we start to use AI more, I think we'll build that list, but I would argue that these are a really good place to start. So if we think about AI use in cities, I think it's great to think about the context of the city, in part because it's where everyone lives. And artificial intelligence is challenging for people to get their heads around because we've got these massive data sets and not everybody understands how data is gathered or used. We've got algorithms, and people's math literacy and comfort is wildly varied. And AI both is individual and collectively impactful. And so there's an opportunity to focus on the collective impact here and the individual impact in a way that'll help us create good algorithmic governance. So we take the example of self-driving cars. If you ask people what do they think about AI, they might talk about Terminator stuff or strange kind of cybernetic things. But if you ask people, do you want automated self-driving cars in your neighborhood? I think ordinary people on the street will start to have really good informed reactions to what the impact of that technology is on their life in terms of the scale of the implementation, whether or not they understand how it's going to work, and what's its potential for harm. And so I think it's this intimacy of AI in real things in the communities in which we live that will make the public able to start to get their heads around what algorithmic governance looks like. And one of the advantages here, I think, is that everybody lives somewhere and people have highly informed opinions about where they live. As a planner, I'm on the receiving end of those highly informed opinions all the time. We think about the reaction of NIMBY, not in my backyard. NIMBY emerges because people have ideas about what are the parameters of change that they're willing to accept, what's okay and what's not okay. When a not in my backyard reaction comes, it's a signal to both planners and neighbors and people in City Hall taking decisions that that's too much change or it's not an appropriate kind of change. And typically NIMBY isn't a good thing in a planning context because it often is exclusionary of change that welcomes more and different kinds of people. But there's the possibility to take that kind of reaction in an artificial intelligence context and try to put it to good work, I think, because it shows us that people are better able to understand the kinds of impacts that this technology can have. In planning for the last 50 years, lots of us have worked with the work of Kevin Lynch. And Kevin Lynch was an architect and an urban designer who talked about how people make mental maps about where they live to help them be able to understand and make sense of the communities in which they live in, and how these mental maps create this idea of legibility, that people can start to figure out how to navigate things that are unfamiliar to them. I think we should start thinking about the applicability of these mental maps and people's innate understandings of how things work and how we can use that kind of understanding, that points of familiarity in the context of creating algorithmic governance processes where people understand how this technology will impact them. And we've got good precedent for that too. We think about algorithmic governance as being technologically based and in the cloud and far away, but if you think about it, the way in which we've built our cities over the last, at least 100 years, we have a democratic process in which when people want to change the environment in which we live, there's oversight and there's policy and there's legislation and there are decisions taken by politicians, but also, at least in Canada, people have a say. There's a legal requirement to consult the public on whether or not they want that change and how that change will impact them. So the door is open in terms of algorithmic governance to start to think about what we're going to do next. The big challenge is, how do we start to build this framework for discussion? One of our principal challenges is that we need to balance the David versus Goliath nature of this. We've got big tech companies, and then we've got individual municipal governments, and we've got citizen groups who aren't equipped to start to compete in this kind of conversation. To pick up on Fenwick's point, you asked the question about what kinds of not-for-profit organizations are going to exist. In other research on open data, and I'll share a link in a second, I just wrote a paper about the role that public libraries play as what we frame as civic intermediaries, people who sit between the institution and the public to help build understanding and to share knowledge in a way that's nonpartisan and trustworthy and defensible, so that we can start to expand public capacity to work with these kinds of tools. So we're going to need to look at other decision-making contexts in terms of how we get the public to wrap their head around AI, and hopefully the piece that I publish in Spacing next week will start to see this conversation. But I'll leave all of you with the challenge of, in what other contexts have you seen these kinds of complicated decision-making processes start to work with the public, where there's highly complex information put into an audience of people who may not be familiar, but where we've created a situation in which the public feedback informs good public policy and decision-making and future action. Thank you.
Thanks, Pamela. So I think Renee will moderate some of the questions that we have coming in. So there was a question asked by Patrick Conley.
Sorry, are you asking me to repeat the question?
Hi, Renee. Sorry. Yep. So I'll just read Patrick's question again. So as someone from Toronto who's really interested in how Google thinks and speaks in public about AI, if you would happen to have a good reference or source that can comment on how Google thinks AI will be used for small decisions.
Right, so I shared a link in the chat from data.parliament.uk, which is the written evidence submitted by Google, in which Google, among other things, talks about, it just sounded like Sauron for a moment, it's such a little thing, the least of rings. That AI will be used essentially as infrastructure, and how there will always be humans who will interpret the results from AI, and that they will use many other mechanisms besides AI and algorithms to make their decisions. So we shouldn't be too worried about them. So if you look in the chat window early on, you'll see the link. Sonia?
Great. Just wanted to remind the rest of our viewers that they can find that in the chat box. So there's another question here coming in from Bram on FCM involvement. Pamela, would you like to take that?
Sure. I think I replied to Bram. I think they'd be a really important partner. The question is this issue really even on their radar? FCM typically, it's interesting in Canada because we don't have strong relationships between the federal government and city governments, except through infrastructure portals. And so we could make a really good case, I think, that AI is a form of infrastructure that could form part of the bundle of the work they do. But this is a lot different than green buildings and pipes and energy systems. And so I think we really need to build the capacity of municipal government focused organizations to start to embrace this work too. And that's the kind of work we've been doing inside Geothink around other forms of technology. And I agree, Bram's right. FCM is a really important partner because they reach across big and small. They cover all municipalities in all 3 coasts. And they've been working on trying to get municipal governments in Canada to tackle issues beyond their borders. So all of their leadership around cities and climate change for the last 20 years sets a good precedent, I think, for taking typically non-municipal issues and bringing them home and making them stick.
Great. And Pamela, there's a question coming in. It's an anonymous question, and so I'll just read it out. You talk about public consent in municipal AI projects. At what point should that be taken into account? Is it ethical for tech companies and/or governments to test technologies without this consent, particularly if information from this testing will be taken into account by any future algorithms?
Thank you so much to our participant who forwarded that comment to me. That's at the heart of what I'm trying to wrestle with in my spacing article. You know, it's really interesting as professors, we can't do any research on human subjects without going through a research ethics board. And we're really pushed hard for very good reason to make sure that we don't do harm in the work they do. Now we have situations in which private sector firms are coming with innovation agendas and creating incubators and experimental spaces working with the public, doing similar research without the same ethics protocol. And so one of the things I'm going to write about next week is this notion of what does consent look like for citizens in public spaces or in communities in which these kinds of technologies are tested? And how do we create a visible and active and vigilant consent structure? I think we all know from anytime you're asked if you want to use, say, Starbucks free public Wi-Fi, people buzz through the terms of use without reading them. And so if people are going to consent to being participants in experiments around artificial intelligence or other technologies, for example, in public spaces, what's the interface that looks like so that you're vigilantly making an informed choice rather than just saying, yeah, go, and then not really understanding the impacts of what you're doing. So I think that question is one of the most important public policy questions for the use of this technology in our communities across Canada. But one, quite frankly, I don't think we're not even close to starting to have that, but they're the kinds of things we like to talk about inside our grant project with our partners.
Great, thank you, Pamela. So we actually have a question from Marusa Levesque, directed to Professor Fenwick McKelvey. So she asks, can you expand on net neutrality and AI? So definitely a relevant discussion going on right now.
Yeah, thanks so much, Marissa. And I just to follow up on that, I posted a couple links from an open media conversation with OkCupid, and I really encourage anybody who has a chance to listen to it. I think that one of the concerns that is at the heart of any of these governance questions is precisely that ethics and research. And the OkCupid admits that they set up and put people up on bad dates all the time. It's part of how they conduct their research. And I think what we really have to start questioning is, where do we legitimate forms of experimentation and risk, and who do we prevent from doing that? And I think that really raises some interesting concerns, and I think connects, a lot of these questions about AI in cities with, I think, what's been going on in the web for a lot. And that's why I think one of the things to me is just thinking that media policy and concerns about regulation and governance of social media, I think, are going to become issues for municipal governance as well. So in terms of what's the link between net neutrality and artificial intelligence, I actually feel as though net neutrality is one of the first test cases of algorithmic media policy. And the concern that and net neutrality is often described as this concern about common carriage. And so for those who don't know, network neutrality refers to this question of whether internet service providers might manage or adversely discriminate certain types of traffic or application on their networks. And this, in one sense, is an ongoing question about common carriage that dates back for a long, long time. To me, and part of what my book project's been about, is trying to think about the ways that networks have become more intelligent. This is what I jokingly refer to as demons, but the programs that are being embedded increasingly in internet infrastructures that are making decisions about how to process and classify and manage traffic dynamically. And what we're seeing is that these programs, or these demons, which typically would be static or kind of not that intelligent, are becoming more intelligent, and increasingly are becoming forms of artificial intelligence, or relying on, particularly machine learning in their decision making. And this raises a governance question. How should demons, as I call them, or how should artificial intelligence be used in networks to manage traffic? And how do you ensure that what demons are doing is accountable? How do you make sure that these things, which are often embedded in deep in infrastructure, are transparent? And how do you ensure that they actually work? And the last point is that Canada presently doesn't throttle, or most ISPs don't presently throttle peer-to-peer traffic, and this is online file sharing. And one of the reasons that they stopped doing that is that a complaint to the CRTC of that Rogers was accidentally throttling World of Warcraft traffic led to a 2-year complaint where Rogers, from what we understand, admitted to accidentally throttling this traffic. And what we know is that they didn't intend to do it, but the systems are so complex that they have unpredictable consequences. And so this is when I'm talking about this kind of complexity issue, is that when you're delegating authority to agents that are acting autonomously, like artificial intelligence, they can be making decisions that you might not necessarily be able to predict in advance. And these, I think, raise really important policy questions. And that's, to me, what this link is between network neutrality. Just to reiterate quickly, it's like, one, it's that these AIs are being deployed to better manage networks, and network neutrality really concerns how we manage those programs. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Fenwick. I hope that answers your question. And just to follow up, there's another one coming in from Rob Davidson. So Rob asks, do you think the focus of TBS Document and Policy Foundation for Responsible AI should be so focused on how government could use AI, or rather should it be more focused on the potential model of governance frameworks that need to be in place before widespread AI deployment, particularly in public service?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one that I initially was weighing myself is that I really think there's just a total gap in AI policy in Canada, and I think that it's just a huge hole. It's something that really that Canada shouldn't be so neglectful of. Now, how do you fix that? And I think what I really think the Treasury Board needs to be credited for is being a participant in that multi-stakeholder conversation. And so I don't think the Treasury Board has the jurisdiction or ability of saying we're going to convene and have a conversation about AI policy in Canada, but they are showing, I think, good faith as actors negotiating how they're going to use AI. What would a process look like? How do you work through some of the risks? How do you talk about a consultation process? I think that they are kind of demonstrating kind of best practices that other organizations should be undertaking first. And then I think second, they're an important part of that multi-stakeholder conversation that needs to take place around AI. Now, who convenes that? Certainly, I think the federal government has a responsibility to bring in the nonprofit sector, academics and researchers, corporate citizens, and as well as the civil service.
I'm going to add to that. I think, we do have precedent from the good old days of environmental assessment where the feds and the provinces provided intervenor funding. They recognized the imbalance between the proponent for large infrastructure projects and the people who might have concerns. There definitely, I would argue, needs to be some kind of deliberate effort to seed capacity in the other side of things. And intervenor funding is one mechanism, but this notion of what's our highest, best capacity and how do we build it in this country to have a robust discussion and public debate before policy decisions are taken really needs to be thought about quickly. And we need some political intervention action because it's going to be impossible for civil society to build this capacity on its own. Canadian philanthropy is involved in some bits and pieces of this, but we don't have the same scale of philanthropic engagement through foundations as, say, American foundations have. Our foundations budgets aren't as big. We don't have as many of them. And we need to do something to help grow the public sector and public good voice in this debate.
And just 2 points on that is that one part of my slides was doing a scan about what nonprofits in the philanthropic sector was doing. So when I said they're not doing anything, that's coming from me asking stakeholders about that. And so, there really isn't, like you have in the United States, you have the AI Now initiative, you have a variety of these interventions taking place. We have nothing like that, and necessarily not anything pathway towards that. I really appreciate your point about the environmental consultancy, because I think that one thing that's often lost to me is that we're creating, and I think to my frustration, often when you think about industry talking about AI, they think that this is a type of innovation that takes place in a vacuum. We have tons of precedents for how do we deal with disruptive technologies, and we have frameworks for consultation, and I work in the broad often with the CRTC, and so I think that really what I think is often forgotten about is just making sure that we also legitimate existing research that has been done that just isn't called AI. And I was just thinking back, I went and got my copy of From Warfare to Welfare by Jennifer Light, which is just talking through the idea of AI and governance has been around for 60 years. And these are things that it's only because we have, I think, a strategic ignorance that we're willing to have some of these debates seem like they're so new, and that it's that there's something novel about the cultural, political consequences of these technologies.
Fenwick, it's quite funny. Renee, Teresa Scaza, and Peter and I have a paper that's going in next Friday that basically makes the same argument, plus que ça change, plus que la même chose, that many of the same technological critiques that have applied to open data and PPGIS can be brought forward in AI. There are some unique things about AI, but lots of this is something new that we need to think about. And so I'm with you and on board that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We just need to ask the hard questions now and create good, open, inclusive frameworks that start to level the playing field. I think the challenging thing about AI is that it's so multi-layered that the public conversation needs to be seated in a slightly different way because the scale and the scope is bigger and there's a lot of opaqueness to what it actually means.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think the last thing is that's where, it's like expertise is really important about how have we done this before? And that's when, we're talking about the environmental thing. I think that's, to me, a next step. It's like, what consultation processes do we have? Because do I want to submit the CRTC's consultation framework on the world for this issue? I'm not entirely sure. But I think that there are models, and that's one of the ways that I'm learning, and look forward to hearing more about that.
I just want to add that one of the things that is different for AI is that we do not know how they work, and the specialists don't know how they work. So unlike, I mean, machine languages veer on the incomprehensible, but I mean, I don't know if you can see this from Minsky and Papert's book on perceptrons, but it's not just that there's a hidden layer of weighted neurons working with each other. There can be many hidden layers. So people literally, it's like, you know how the neuron in the brain works, but you really don't know how the brain works. So that's our grand challenge, is how much we can actually make this stuff legible.
And just following up on that, there's another follow-up from Patrick on thinking of AI as an abstraction to make the complex more simple, of which we have many in government and society. Is there a precedent either for or against to asking for these abstractions to be made legible or interrogable when they're related to collective decision making?
So one way we can do that, and it's not a perfect method, is with the algorithmic audit. So and that would force the developers to accept our training data, and we examine what the output is, and we submit lots and lots of dueling training sets. There's also initiative I didn't mention to try to unbias the training data and to determine what comes out as a result. But as Elizabeth was mentioning, when we have such fine-grained customized results, it becomes increasingly difficult to even understand what the output is, because deliberately the AI may be producing output for you that differs from every single other person.
I'm just sharing something quickly, and I think that there's two things just to build on that. Is that one, I think training data is one of the kind of underappreciated problems in AI policy. Is that for all these machine learning classifiers, like the reason that we're going through this like intense excitement about AI in the first place is really like machine learning and deep learning both are subsets of the wider field of artificial intelligence and really depend on volumes of data and the move to GPUs to be able to do high-speed, parallel processing computation. So, but all I say is that data is the front and center to that. And what they call it is training data, which is how you have machine learning or deep learning classifiers, improve their technique. And what are the sources of training data? And what are the sources of training data that are Canadian? I think that's one big issue in terms of like, what's the scope of AI in Canada, or what are the sources of Canadian AI training data? Like one of the things that I think comes up for, say, the government of Canada, if it starts using a chatbot, and it uses Reddit for the chatbot, does that then demonstrate a proper set of training data to have cultural sensitivity when talking about Indigenous people in Canada? If this is Reddit, it's the source of it. So I think that really when we're talking, and I don't know what the sources of Canadian training data or appropriate training data is in Canada. And that's, I think, one of the gaps that I think is really important. I'll just add a link here to a good example of what, basically just AI is to be sexist through bad training data.
So I'll pick up on that. And one of the things that, again, I'm working on in the spacing piece is looking at Smart Chicago has a civic user testing group where they pay people from a variety of communities to test their civic technology. And the idea is that people's wisdom and time are worth money, and they often go into communities that aren't typically engaged in user testing research. So there's this interesting working relationship between the tech community and what some people might call marginalized communities. And so they have a model that's already working that involves recognition of expertise and flow of cash. to community-based groups that might be worth thinking about, Fenwick, to your point about trying to train the bots. Like what's the parallel equivalent in AI, which is how do we train things to work ethically in the context in which we need this work to happen, especially if it's government use of bots, right? Because we can't have racist bots doing government answering of things, right? So I think there are some examples from the civic tech sector that we could look at.
And just on that, I think and the only reason I'm raising the government is I think they can be leaders in this. And I think that's one of the spaces when you talk about intervention and why I think the Treasury Board should be in many ways commended, because unless you really set a high bar and you can find an agency to do that, then it's going to be, I think that all I say is I think that's a really important way you can talk about a policy intervention is working with, working to ensure that we have best practices and standards. And I think that that's one of the ways I see going forward in terms of AI policies, working to ensure that we do have cases we can look to. And that's why I think the New York example. And just the second thing, I'm just going to also put a plug here for just how old some of these things are, is some of the work of Norbert Wiener way back in the day. And so I just picked up a copy of God and Gollum. But he used the example of the monkey's fist. He goes on this parable tale. But he is arguing that the monkey's fist is a great example of what could be the problems with machine learning. Is that if you want it to do something, well, it'll learn how to do it. It might be the most awful, horrible way of doing it. So that's the parable of the monkey fist. Is you ask for $200 and you get the $200 because someone you lose an arm in an accident or something like that. That's the compensation. But I think that he's talking about this in the 1960s, and so I think to me it's how much that he's a marginal figure is really an example of the detriment and some of the reasons that the social sciences and humanities have such an essential role to play in this conversation. And I think it does baffle me why these points, which have been raised by much more important people than me, continue to go unanswered by certain developers.
I'd also recommend science fiction, especially books like Halting State by Charlie Strauss, Bruce Sterling's books, and Ian MacDonald has some great books. One of his tasks is to burst this very American notion of artificial intelligence. So he has AI robots in India.
Yes, and we certainly need more diversity in the examples and the conceptualizations of AI. So thank you for bringing that up, Renee. Just a reminder to our viewers that we have about 6 minutes left in our panel. So now is the time to ask your final pressing questions to our panelists. We've also been live tweeting some questions from the chat box to those of you joining us via telephone. So you can check at Geothink.CA. Any final concluding remarks or other questions?
There was a question for Elizabeth. Several philosophers have tried to find or design a logical structure to explain the moral and ethical issues and deducting, I think it's probably deducing general and acceptable outcomes. For example, Kant's moral imperatives. Is it possible to think of codifying this logical structure in algorithms and AI?
It's a really interesting question because, of course, there is no single consensus on what the moral or ethical position would be to do. And the classic area where this is coming up is in autonomous vehicles with the renaissance of the trolley problem. So the idea that you've got the trolley problem going down with a spur in the track, and if it goes on its track, it's going to go and hit 5 people. If you go and actually actively pull the lever, it will kill only 1. Most people do that because it's utilitarian if you ask them that. But then if you ask them to push somebody off a bridge and stop the train that way, it's still 1 person. People get squeamish about that. And so this is coming up now with the programming with autonomous vehicles. And so whereas if you're on a highway and you're making, there's going to be an inevitable impact and you're making a decision as a driver in the heat of the moment, people don't tend to ascribe moral culpability to that because it's something that's happening all of a sudden. But if you're pre-programming and predetermining at the algorithmic level what that car is going to do, is it going to hit the motorcyclist? Is it going to hit the SUV? Is it going to hit you and go and make you go off the cliff? It all of a sudden it seems to have more moral implications and be more culpability. And there's some interesting research from last year that the people look to the law to figure out what the moral position is. And so if the law says it's criminal homicide to kill those people, people are less likely to pull the lever. If it says that that is excused, people pull the lever. So there is sort of a cycle now going on with technology and law following each other. The law looking to an autonomous vehicle and saying, well, that's the programming and therefore nobody's liable. And the programming looking to law and saying, well, that's the programming that we should have. So it isn't really clear where the, sort of outside area is that has the moral position that we then ascribe either in the law or someplace else. So it is a really interesting question, the whole chicken and egg about how we figure out what the single moral position is that we should adopt in these codes.
Great, thanks, Elizabeth. So we have some questions coming in from Patrick, I believe. Oh, no, I'm sorry, from Diego. On the need of legislation being an important issue of all ML and AI utilized in public service infrastructure. So just a final comment there, reiterating the importance. Any other concluding remarks?
Well, it's going to be a multi-pronged effort to Diogo and others. Legislation only gets you so far. I think that it is important for us to think about what mandates we do want to put on transparency and how we balance that with privacy, if that is an issue, and with entrepreneurialism. But on the other hand, it is important as well to have a culture of fairness and equity. And I think to Fenwick's point about the way in which the reemergence of perceptrons and neural networks has come about because of big data, that we have to be and most of this data is crowdsourced. We have to be very skeptical about the bias implicit in that, and perhaps force or create a culture in which the programmers and companies are both skeptical and feel compelled to clean that data in some way. So I think it's both education on our own part, so we don't think about it in terms of the robots are going to take our jobs, or the bots are going to take our jobs. Maybe that's also the case. Or they're going to start World War III, or they're going to make our lives horribly convenient. And we cannot also understate how many people privately want these things because they think government is too biased, and if only there was a technocracy that could solve all these problems neutrally, well, we would naturally have, the technology will give us a fairer society. Ha ha ha, wah ha ha. Right? That's not going to happen. So I think that we need to tackle many, many fronts to make sure that we know a little bit more about AI than we do currently.
And just to build on that, I mean, this is where I think there's a sound link between media policy and artificial intelligence. I mean, the reason that it's Google and Facebook investing in this is they are the sources of data, and users are willingly submitting them. And so they're figuring out better ways of leveraging what is their strategic resource. And they're figuring out more and more ways of being able to monetize the content that's being uploaded to their systems. And to me, I think this raises a very big question about the development of AI, is that we often talk now about an era of platform capitalism, and that these platforms, which are increasingly reliant on data for the logistics and operations, but also business models, are turning to AI, and that's just driving an investment and development in AI. And I think that that's actually why science fiction is so critically relevant these days, is because it's only one of the few sources of imagining a different future than the one being developed by Silicon Valley.
Absolutely. Okay, so I think I'd like to thank all the panelists for their engaging talks, but especially to the viewers today and to the attendees for posting such great questions and having such a engaging conversation here on our chat feature, as well on the webinar. I'd just like to close off with a few final reminders. Geothink will be posting the entire recording of this event on our website at geothink.ca. So you can check for the PowerPoint slides and the video recording there. Feel free to email us or tweet any questions you may have about this event at geothink.ca. And a final reminder that our next Geothink and Learn will be December 20th at the same time at noon Eastern on a special issue of Open Data Standards Directory with the Center for Governance Excellence at Johns Hopkins University. So I'd like to remind everyone to tune into that and register. And all the information is up on our website as usual. January's event will be on data and social justice, so picking up on some of the important issues raised here. So thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.